early in the morning, there were the corpses, all dead.
Thank you, brother, so much, and such a blessing to be with you all this morning. It is a wonderful privilege that we have to be able to come together and worship our God in spirit and in truth. And what a tremendous blessing to, as was mentioned in the prayer, and as we continually sing and are reminded of, to be amongst the creation and to be reminded of our Creator and to be provoked to study His will and to abide in it, to be encouraged to remain in it, and to be equipped so that we can instruct others how they too can live and have hope in it. What a blessing it is for us to be able to come together. We had a wonderful time together yesterday as the youth got together and spent some time with a youth devotional and a fellowship. It was a tremendous blessing to see as many young people as was there. I'd say there's about a dozen or so young people plus, and it was great to see them all, and so grateful for all the work that went in as well. Great deal of work took place beforehand and during, and I'm sure afterward, in order to make it a reality, and what a blessing it was. I was not raised or brought up in attending the services of the church, being associated with the congregation of God's people, and I missed all of those experiences, and I, of course, am told of stories and told of the great memories and value that came with young people who were brought up in the Lord's church to have such events take place. And I can tell you, to see my children be able to participate in it and see the young people associated with this congregation be able to participate in it, I am tremendously encouraged and so grateful for the work that goes on in that respect, as well as all the work that we have going on as a congregation. A few things coming up. Keep in mind our Soul Seeking Saturday, which will take place, Lord willing, next Saturday, March the 18th. We'll meet here at the building at 9 a.m. We'll then go out and distribute flyers so that those in this local area and community can be made aware of our upcoming gospel meeting. Our gospel meeting will be held by Jeremy Pate, Lord willing, the end of March, Friday, March the 31st at 7 p.m. We'll have our first meeting time. And then we'll also meet Saturday, April 1st at 11 a.m. And then we'll have the continuation and final lessons of that meeting the next day during our service times on April the 2nd. Jeremy Pate works for Apologetics Press. He also was at one time local to this area, is familiar with this area. He's been here to this congregation before. We love and care about Jeremy and his family. And he'll be presenting to us a series of lessons on Christian evidences as it relates to creation, as it relates to the canon concerning the Bible and the inspired writ, and as it relates to Christ and God's redemptive plan. And then also keep in mind our upcoming building and ground cleanup mid-April, April 15th, at least now it's planned for 9 a.m. And we'll be cleaning up and doing some spring cleaning around the building and around the grounds. We do this just about every year, and you'd think by the time we get done, hey, there's no way we'd have a whole lot to do next year, and we always do. So look forward to that. And then, of course, the Ladies' Day is coming up toward the end of April, April the 29th. Also, we'll have in June, the 23rd and the 24th, a men's retreat. And I bring that up just to say there's some planning that needs to take place as it relates to the men's retreat. And so all men are encouraged to attend a meeting that will take place March the 26th at 12:45, just to get together to talk about what it is we want to do for the men's retreat scheduled for June the 23rd and 24th. And that may not be the only meeting that we have, but that will at least kick us off to get our minds thinking in regards to what it is we want to do, what it is we want to accomplish, where it is we want to go. And so be ready to bring your ideas and thoughts, men. And we'll plan and discuss that. I know Steve's involved as well, and so I'm thankful for him and leading the charge in that respect. And we'll, again, meet and discuss and collaborate on the 26th in between services at 12:45. And so with that in view, let us dive into our sermon material. And we are now in the thick of this book that we've been studying. Is the Bible God's Word? Is the Bible God's Word? And over the next several weeks, over the next several months, we're going to be really getting into the nitty-gritty. We're going to be getting into the more challenging aspects of this book in terms of what it is we're typically used to studying and the way in which we're typically used to examining the Bible. Up to this point, we've been able to pretty easily make application. We've been pretty easily able to go through various verses in the Bible to get a better understanding and strengthen our convictions as to the knowledge that the Bible is given to us by Almighty God. But now we're going to be going into the archaeological aspect in order to better understand and equip ourselves with additional evidences that aid us in knowing that what we find in the Bible indeed was inspired and has come from God. And that is a little bit more challenging because now we're looking at things that has to do with Dr. Jones. And when I say Dr. Jones, I'm referring, of course, to Indiana. I'm referring, of course, to Indiana Jones. And yes, those movies may be fascinating, they may be entertaining, but if you think about just the work of archaeology, unless you're just really into it and you like to nerd out into that category of study, it can be challenging to really kind of understand what it is you're looking at, how it's related to history, what it is you're really finding, and so forth. I don't know about you, but I've seen several of those movies quite a few times, and I'm still a little murky in terms of what it is they're really finding and how really it's relevant. I mean, it's hard to kind of wrap your mind and really wrap your arms around archaeology type material. And so this part of the text for several weeks and months, that's what we're going to be getting into. And you might be wrestling a little bit and having to go back and reread some of these pages, but that's valuable. And I want you to think about it from an entertaining perspective once again for just a second. And think about categories that we find as it relates to diving deeper and more into the weeds of a particular context as it relates to an overarching story. In entertainment, they call this origin stories, right? We find this as it relates to Star Wars, for example. We understand, those of you who are interested in Star Wars, there's the Skywalker saga. And within the overall Skywalker storyline, then, there's all kinds of micro stories that will be provided from an entertainment perspective. Or maybe Marvel, for example. You have the overarching Avengers and these amazing superheroes that come together and do incredible things. But then in the middle of that big, huge story, there's one small little scene that might just be a minute or two long. And then guess what? They'll launch a whole series of origin stories as it relates to that one particular aspect. DC has the same approach. Now even I've been told the Lord of the Rings, they're going to have that on Amazon Prime. They're going to start creating origin stories of all the characters in the Lord of the Rings. And let me tell you, my understanding is those who are traditionalist Tolkien fans are pretty upset about that because apparently they're going to deviate from his initial writings and storyline. But we understand from an entertainment perspective how that's interesting. Hey, I get to dive a little deeper into this thing that I'm interested in and look at the detail here. Look at what I'm finding here. This is really fascinating. Well, when we talk about archaeology, that's what we're really looking at. We understand the entire plan of redemption. We understand the Bible in terms of what God has brought forth to mankind from Genesis to Revelation, that salvation is found via the gospel, Romans chapter 1 verse 16. But then, as we think about archaeology, as various things are mined out of the earth oftentimes, and it's examined and evaluated and even initially discovered, people start to say, hey, this is what we read about in the Bible. And that's exciting. Because it is an aid that further validates what we find in the Scriptures. We don't rely on that in order to know what we know, but yet as archaeology continues to be explored and as different artifacts continue to be discovered and found, more and more proof more and more evidence comes to light in terms of what we're already reading and studying in the Scriptures. So with that in view, I want us to think about what we find as it relates to Assyria and their battlefront against God's people, and the Assyrian monarch known as Sennacherib, and what Sennacherib did in terms of his conquest on the Palestine region where God's people dwelt. You find, for example, in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, in verse 9, we read there, "After this did Sennacherib, king of Assyria, send his servants to Jerusalem, but he himself laid siege against Lachish, and all his power with him, unto Hezekiah, king of Judah, and unto all Judah that were at Jerusalem." Sennacherib went and he took on the various cities surrounding Jerusalem and the region where God's people dwelt. And we find cities such as Lachish were indeed attacked and conquered. And Sennacherib would actually build and settle there in Nineveh. We read in verse 1 in 2 Chronicles chapter 32, we find him encamping against the fenced cities here amongst God's people. And we understand that where he built a palace, one of those places would be Nineveh. And as archaeology has investigated this area of Nineveh, we find that a wall was discovered. And this wall in particular was about 70 feet high. And in this wall was carved out various events that Sennacherib engaged in to document what it was that he was doing in that region. For example, you find some of the archaeologists and some of those that have studied these various artifacts in these various regions and what's been documented. It states here, for example, Ephraim Stern describes the events that are pictured here. He says, the main scene shows the attack on the gate wall of Lachish. The protruding city gate is presented in minute detail. It's got special reinforcements shown, superstructures of warrior shields, the battering rams that are moved over specially constructed ramps covered with wooden logs. They were prefabricated, four-wheeled machines. And the scene is vividly showing frenzied fighting between both the attackers and the defenders in the final stages of the battle. And so what's the takeaway here for us? The takeaway is there's an Assyrian nation seeking to conquer surrounding lands, seeking to take over God's people, and in all the varying cities surrounding Jerusalem within the regions where God's people dwelt, Sennacherib builds his palace in Nineveh and begins to depict all kinds of scenes of cities that he's overtaken, one of them being Lachish. And he depicts in very strict detail, very flamboyant detail in terms of what it was they were able to accomplish. Well, I want you to also think about now Jerusalem and the concern that God's people would have had as it relates to whether or not Jerusalem would have likewise been taken. God's people, their worship, their capital, ultimately a desire for it to be defended. We see in 2 Kings chapter 20, 2 Kings chapter 20, the work that was done by Hezekiah as it relates to the efforts to make sure God's people would be defended and cared for. 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 20, the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and all his might, and how he made a pool and a conduit and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah. Go back over there now to 2 Chronicles and look here at chapter 32 once again. And notice in verse 30, 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and verse 30, this same Hezekiah also stopped the upper water course of Gihon and brought it straight down to the west side of the city of David. And Hezekiah prospered in all his works. What are we finding here in these two verses? We're finding that Hezekiah, knowing that Jerusalem would have to be fortified and walled in, but would need access to water, and the fact that the enemy might indeed cut off their water supply, was going to have to figure out a way to transport water into the city of Jerusalem. And so what does the Bible say that Hezekiah did? He made sure to pool water and create waterways under Jerusalem so that God's people would not be cut off and would still be able to be nourished. What has archaeology found in this respect? Well, in 1880, Hezekiah's tunnel efforts, there was found an inscription, and it was at a particular place within the waterways of what Hezekiah built, as boys were playing around in those waterways, which are still in existence today and are still referred to as Hezekiah's tunnel. You find, for example, what was discovered in 1880 and this inscription written on the wall about 20 feet from the exit, detailed as to how exactly this tunnel was made. They inscribed, and this was the account of the breakthrough. While the laborers were still working with their picks, each toward the other, and while there were still 3 cubits to be broken through, the voice of each was heard calling to the other. Because there was a crack or a split or overlap in the rock from the south to the north. And at that moment of the breakthrough, the laborers struck each toward the other, pick against pick. And water flowed from the spring to the pool for 1,200 cubits, and the height of the rock above the heads of the laborers was 100 cubits. In other words, Hezekiah had commissioned that in order for God's people to be protected, in the case that the water supply was cut off and water would continue to flow within Jerusalem, this tunnel needed to be constructed. And as it was being constructed, you can imagine workers working this side and workers working that side, and rock continuing to exist. And as they would continue to mine out the rock, they started hearing each other. And what an exciting moment that must have been, knowing that the work was almost done. Knowing that their efforts were not in vain, that finally the tunnel was about to be completed. And as they heard each other's voices, the rock eventually fell, the water began to flow, and you know what they decided? You know what? We need to document this very moment. What a special moment this is that God's people accomplished this so that they could survive the possibility being trapped. Sennacherib, on his attacks in the region where God's people are dwelling, overpowering city after city after city, having a palace in Nineveh, taking over Lachish, documenting it on his palace walls, getting ready to take over Jerusalem. God's people and Hezekiah, knowing that they would need to be protected, make sure that water can still flow within Jerusalem. Then we find what Tom read a few minutes ago. Because we begin to wonder, well, whatever happened to Jerusalem? He overtook all these other cities. He documented tremendous carve-outs that showed the scene of when he would overtake city after city. What about Jerusalem? What did Assyria do? What did Sennacherib do? Were God's people protected? Did God's people prevail? How would it have been possible that they would have? Isaiah chapter 31. As Tom read just a few minutes ago, noting there what it is that God's people had provided for them by God Himself. Isaiah chapter 37, rather, and verse 36. The angel of the Lord went forth and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. And when they arose early in the morning, behold, they were all dead corpses. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, verse 37, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. The enemy literally woke up dead. They didn't wake up. Now you might say, well, how is this so fascinating? And what exactly am I gaining here? I get we have archaeological proof that Sennacherib overtook Lachish, that Sennacherib dwelt in Nineveh, that Sennacherib documented all his conquests and these great victories. But what's so fascinating about the fact that he doesn't seem to have any documentation on his walls regarding Jerusalem? How did Sennacherib describe Jerusalem? I mean, his men just died and then he returns back to Nineveh. So how does he view all this? Well, in 1830, a British colonel by the name of R. Taylor found what has now been called the Taylor Prism, which records Sennacherib's narrative of his conquests. And on that prism, Sennacherib inscribed the following. As to Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke. I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, walled forts, and to the countless small villages in their vicinity, and conquered them by means of well-stamped earth ramps, battering rams brought near, the attack by foot soldiers, mines, breaches, as well as sapper work. I drove out 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, big and small cattle beyond counting, and considered them booty. What has Sennacherib bragged about here? Well, look at all these cities I conquered. Look at all the treasure I got for myself. Look at what I did to conquer it, which, by the way, maps exactly to the scenes that were depicted on his palace walls. This is how I did it, he said. Sennacherib, what about Jerusalem? Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem. Oh, so you kind of trapped him in there. His royal residence, like a bird in a cage. I surrounded him with earthwork in order to molest those who were leaving his city's gates. It's an mission, essentially. Sennacherib basically says, I made it all the way to Jerusalem. I conquered all the cities around it. I trapped him in there. But I wasn't ever able to actually take the city. Why? Well, because as they surrounded it, Sennacherib's army was struck dead in the middle of the night by the angel of the Lord. Have you ever been to Warm Springs, Georgia? I have. I've been there a few times. Beautiful scene, by the way, that little town, especially in the month of December. Very festive, beautiful lights. Get nice little treats and enjoy the scenery. But Warm Springs is primarily known not for that little town and that time of year. It's known rather instead for what's called the Little White House. Place where one of our former presidents, FDR, came and resided in hopes that he might be able to find some level of relief, if not a cure, for polio. Now, I didn't live back then. I don't know FDR. I've read about him. I've seen some pictures of him, but I don't really know who he is or exactly what all happened. I can't fully imagine what it would have been like for him, given his handicap and leading in the executive branch the way that he did, especially given the time in our country and what we were facing. But when I go to Warm Springs, and I get to see the rooms, the beds, the way things were constructed, the desks, the way he operated, given his handicap, all of that just aids in my understanding concerning the account of FDR and his presidency. Now, these verses that we've read and these archaeological finds that we've discussed and more that we'll continue to discuss, we can choose to look at them however we'd like. And we can choose to kind of gloss over and get lost in all the details of the dates and the nations, and etc. Or we can choose instead to understand the beauty that is found when we look at the minute detail that further supports, via these artifacts, the evidence and fact that God has provided us His Word so that we can live with Him for all of eternity. See, God's people needed to be protected. God's people needed to be preserved. Hezekiah had changed course compared to previous kings, had decided to clean things up and go back to God's plan. And that was important because who is it that would come out of the nation of Israel? Christ. And without the preservation of that nation, if Sennacherib would have overtaken Jerusalem and destroyed it, we would not have had the gospel come to fruition. And the blessing that through it, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, that God has delivered salvation unto mankind. What a blessing it is to review this account, see this origin story, if you will, and to see these archaeological evidences that validate what the Bible has shown us concerning a fascinating night in which Sennacherib's army died in the middle of the night. And Jerusalem was never taken. Maybe you're here this morning and you're not yet a child of God. You've not yet made the decision to accept and live by that gospel that brings salvation, that God has graciously provided to mankind. Won't you make the decision to become a child of God by putting on Christ via baptism, as we read about in Galatians chapter 3, 26 and 27. Brother or sister, maybe you have fallen out of step with the Word of God. You no longer value the Bible as that which has